People are building things here in America again, and this moment calls for the best of America, our people. Introducing America's Workforce Academy, built by Meta, a program helping to train the next generation of welders, fiber installers, crew leaders, and more. Paid training, a job, and a path to America's future. Because the future is for everyone. Learn more at meta.com/America's Workforce Academy.
They say if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. At Amica Insurance, we're built for our customers and prioritize your needs. Visit amica.com and get a quote today.
Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. After the First World War, John Maynard Keynes, who had been at Paris with the British delegation to negotiate through the Paris Peace Conference to the Treaty of Versailles, wrote in his book The Economic Consequences of the Peace what an enormous missed opportunity the peace itself was, and how the kind of Carthaginian nature of the peace, the punishment of Germany, would set into motion terrible consequences. He didn't so much prefigure or predict Nazism, in that he predicted endless global instability. And instead, he said that some of the main issues that went unaddressed were the kind of the recovery and rehabilitation of Europe. He said that there was nothing that had been done or said about the problem of Russia and the Bolshevik Revolution and drawing Russia into the world system. And he basically said that the world would exist in a kind of perma-crisis as a result. In different ways, Clemenceau, who wasn't necessarily critiquing the economic consequences of the peace, but essentially he thought that the peace wasn't Carthaginian enough. He said basically, we'll have to fight this war again in 20 years. And in both ways, they were right. Keynes argued that new systems of economic international cooperation were needed. And Clemenceau said, if you're going to punish the Germans, punish them to the point at which they never rise again. So, with that in mind, my thoughts turn to the end of the Second World War and to the end of the Cold War. And at the end of the Second World War, there isn't a treaty really. There are conferences. There is the final Potsdam Conference, in which the final division of Germany is agreed. But there's no overall settlement between the great powers and the vanquished powers. Um, and that's perhaps to do with the change of tensions or the development of tensions between the victorious powers that precipitate the Cold War. And it's sort of even worse than that is the fallout at the end of the Cold War, um, in which the opportunities for a new world settlement, which might have um, ameliorated or even kind of mitigated some of the crises we currently face, was there. It was advocated by both sides, by actors on both sides, um, and yet it never emerged. What we got was free market triumphalism and essentially the dismemberment of the Soviet Union with predictably disastrous results. So I'm looking at John Gray's excellent book, False Dawn. It's quite about 25 years old now, this book. And he writes in chapter 6 about anarcho-capitalism in post-communist Russia. There are two quotes here. The first is from Bertrand Russell. And this, obviously, Bertrand Russell was writing in the aftermath of the First World War. The Bolsheviks represent an alien philosophy of life, which cannot be forced upon the people without a change of instinct, habit, and tradition so profound as they dry up the vital springs of action, producing listlessness and despair amongst ignorant victims of militant enlightenment. And L. Shestov writes, with few exceptions, Russian writers really despise the pettiness of the West. Even those who admired Europe have done so because they failed most completely to understand her. They do not want to understand her. That is why they have always taken European ideas in such fantastic forms. John Gray writes, Russia has been the site of two experiments in Western utopianism during this century. The first was Bolshevism. In its earliest and most radical phase, War Communism, it produced deindustrialization and famine. It led to Stalin's revolution from above, in which the collectivization of agriculture destroyed peasant farming in Russia. The second was shock therapy, implemented briefly in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. Shock therapy aimed to construct a free market in post-communist Russia. It produced instead a species of mafia-dominated anarcho-capitalism. Both utopian experiments had enormous human costs. Both were failed modernizations guided by Western theories or models that had little relevance to Russia's history or circumstances. Now, here is where it really kind of baffles and troubles me. There are innumerable documentaries written about the first experiment. Whatever one thinks of the Bolsheviks, whatever one thinks of Lenin, whatever one thinks of Stalin, go to a bookshop in the UK or Canada or the US or any other Western country, and you'll find a section on the horrors of Soviet communism. Rightly so. You read about Moscow in 1937, the Gulag system, the kind of the everyday kind of privations and hardships under Stalinism. It is a kind of, I don't want to say necessarily a warning to history, but it is a kind of a monument to when a revolution takes hold in a state unable to support it, so socially, industrially, is surrounded by enemies and exists in a state of permanent siege, with the instinct to find internal enemies and traitors consistently. That is, whatever Stalinism's perhaps achievements were, and there were some, it's based on a mountain of bodies. But there are very few books available, or very few sources of information publicly available about the second utopian experiment and the extent to which that led to hardship and loss of life, collapsing life expectancies, poverty, gangsterism, violence, and an oligarchic state that was then eventually centralized under Vladimir Putin. One would argue that that is an equally important story, an equally important warning, because the kind of mafiaization of Russian politics, unlike Bolshevism, has spread far more successfully. And I think if you look at countries as diverse as Orban's Hungary, RIP, Trump's America, the future that Farage has for Great Britain in mind, I mean, again, it's slightly disingenuous to say, well, it's all the Russians, you see. I mean, I don't necessarily believe that Russian influence operations aren't involved, but fine. Look at any major power: China, Russia, India, Israel. There are influence operations here in the UK being run by all of them constantly, and probably others too. However, the UK has its own oligarchic class that doesn't need Russian permission to cause all sorts of crises in public life, as does America. I doubt, who knows what Trump did or didn't do in Moscow. But I don't personally believe that the explanation for things going dreadfully wrong in America is, a cunning plan concocted in Moscow. It's all a bit too James Bond. Between 1918 and 1921, the Bolsheviks attempted to transform Russia into a communist economy. The war communism which the Bolsheviks tried to impose on Russia during those years embodied an authentic Marxian version. It attempted to abolish capitalism, in which private property, market exchange, and the institution of money were central, and construct an economy that was collectively owned and rationally planned. Yeah, to some extent, but the war bit is really important here. Not only was Lenin using it as an opportunity to eliminate social enemies, but also it was a device for trying to win the war. It's not a very successful one, but a way of controlling all resources. War communism was consistent with some Russian traits, such as the hostility to commercial self-enrichment and the sense of the country's messianic role that have always been a feature of Russian Orthodox Christianity. Yet it was not a simple expectation of expression of Russian traditions. Well, no, of course it wasn't. It waged a war on the mir, the peasant community, and the traditions of Russian peasant life. But in this, it embodied a brutal modernization from above, that the antecedents in the despotic westernization imposed by Peter the Great. Yeah, fair point. War communism was inevitably conditioned by the paradoxes of Russian history, but its roots were in the European Enlightenment to which classical Marxism belonged. Like the Great Leap Forward in China, war communism was a Western utopia. It was not an experiment forced on the Bolsheviks by the exigencies of war. Well, yes, it was. But a Marxian embodiment of the Enlightenment project of a universal civilization. Okay, let's take a pause, John Gray. So you cannot look at war communism out with the context of the First World War and the Russian Civil War. The Bolsheviks were a regime surrounded by enemies. They were fighting to defeat counter-revolutionaries in Russia, and it was a kind of like a zero-sum fight. Either you lot all hang or we do, and there's no middle ground. There will be no prisoners taken, no nothing. The British, the Americans, the French, the Japanese, and the Czechs, who were there as the Czech Legion, had all pitched in to overthrow the revolution. And the White Armies wanted to hang every Bolshevik from the trees as they went. So yes, it is informed by the desire of Lenin to consolidate and grow state power massively. And had it not been for the failure of war communism, he might have persisted with that and not embraced the NEP. But, and here is where I take issue with John Gray, I don't think it is valid to say, well, it's just this big utopian Marxist project. I mean, I haven't, I'm yet to find the bit of Marx that says do war communism. Um, Marx can be read in many ways. I haven't exactly read that bit, but anyway, if you're a Marxist scholar, please do write in. In the aftermath of the Soviet collapse in 1991, another westernizing project was undertaken in Russia. Through policies of shock therapy implemented by Yegor Gaidar, the post-communist government of Boris Yeltsin attempted to follow the advice of transnational organizations and Western advisors and transplant an American-style market economy in Russia. Predictably and indeed inevitably, the attempt failed. A new species of Russian capitalism emerged, different from any in the West and from those that have developed in other post-communist countries. Russia's future lies with this indigenous capitalism, not with the model that Gaidar, as the last of a long line of Russian westernizers, tried in 1992-3 to vainly impose on the country. The policies of Yeltsin's government since the abandonment of shock therapy suggested that he and his advisors have recognized that modernization on the model of any Western market economy is not feasible in Russia, nor perhaps is it desirable. So the shock therapy bit didn't last that long, but its consequences are still with us. In Russia today, so this was published in, one moment. This is 2002, this edition. So I presume it refers to then. In Russia today, economic development and state building are inseparable. They must go together if the bandit capitalism of the immediate post-communist period is to be outgrown. It wasn't. A modern state with effective institutions of enforcement is a precondition of sustainable modernization. The modernity that Russia has yet to achieve cannot simply be that of a European nation. Inevitably, it will be that of a country having both European and Asian interests and traditions. Neither the economic nor the political institutions of any other country can be transplanted to the unique circumstances of post-communist Russia. Now, here's a bit of grey that I always agree with. If you look at Great Britain, okay, the political institutions of Britain's sort of structures of capitalism and structures of the state, the way that kind of political and civil life works in Great Britain are the product of specific historical circumstances. The fact that there is an NHS in Great Britain, and it doesn't exist, say, in the United States of America, doesn't mean that an American-style model of private health insurance can be transplanted here. You'd have a revolution. Of that, I'm fairly sure. And certainly, whether an NHS can be transplanted to America is a moot point. Can America and Americans, through democratic processes, create their own systems of effective public health? Sure, yeah. Anywhere in the world can do that. But most institutions emerge as a result of kind of the history and culture of a particular country. This is why the idea of state building in the early 21st century, Iraq, Afghanistan, was stupid on an epic scale. When you have the Bush neocons not understanding that there are different ethnic groups in Iraq, there are Sunnis and Kurds and Shias, and that meddling with that will cause anarchy. I mean, they probably didn't even care anyway. Um, the idea that you can sweep away Saddam Hussein's kind of corrupt Arab nationalist state, this is a Ba'athist state, and impose a kind of liberal democracy that one would imagine that existed in America, obviously highly illiberal democracy post 9/11, and that you would suddenly get westernized people who vote every 4 years, watch American TV, engage in sort of free market activities. By the way, they're, you know, having been across the Middle East, there are all those kinds of people who do all sorts of notionally westernized things, but also who are deeply embedded in their own society and culture. And you know, teaching them, or not that there's anything to teach because people understand about things like voting, but imposing new systems upon them because you've just spent months bombing their country is this kind of ludicrous concept, and highly utopian as well. I remember there was a bit of a kind of blood-chilling moment in a documentary about Tony Blair, and I forget who it was, one of his insiders, after the fall of Saddam Hussein, said that Blair had said, if I had my way, we would have done Mugabe as well. Started a war to liberate Zimbabwe in southern Africa, and in a similar kind of state building fashion. But Russia, Germany, France, Britain, America, wherever, can only produce the kind of the institutions and the politics that they can produce. And if something like democracy emerges, this increasingly tainted concept, then it is the product of a long historical journey. I suppose America, after the Second World War, with the rebuilding of Japan and the rebuilding of West Germany, became fooled into thinking that this was a historical inevitability. In many of the other cases, it failed. But again, I suppose for much of the Cold War, they weren't trying to build democracies. They were trying to prop up regimes like Diem in South Vietnam and General Pinochet. As was true of the Soviet Union throughout its 70-odd year history, war communism was an attempt to modernize Russia on a Western model. Richard Pipes had written that war communism as a whole was not a temporary measure, but an ambitious, as it was turned out, pre-natural attempt to introduce full-blown communism. Like all utopias, war communism required an unprecedented alteration in human nature before it could be established. As Feiges, so he's citing Pipes and Feiges here, and I'll put actually a link towards my historiography page so you can have a look at both of them further. As Orlando Feiges has put it, the ultimate aim of the communist system was the transformation of human nature. It was an aim shared by other so-called totalitarian regimes in the interwar period. This, after all, was an age of utopian optimism in the potential science to change human life. The Bolshevik program was based on the ideas of the Enlightenment. It stemmed from Kant as much as from Marx, which makes Western liberals, even in this age of postmodernism, sympathize with it. Lenin recognized that war communism was a utopia. The Bolsheviks, he observed, were engineers of souls. In his utopian blueprint State and Revolution, he envisaged a communist society in which there would be no army and no police, and all remaining state functions could be performed by anyone. In short run, it might be necessary to retain some of the practices of capitalism. In the longer run, the rational economy would be moneyless, propertyless, stateless, and yet centrally planned. He did, in fairness, Lenin, almost immediately rolled back on that and said, well, no, actually, this is too utopian, and we will need to retain the key features of a repressive state. And that state will be there to repress enemy classes. So the utopianism of it, yeah. Through his advocacy of the militarization of labor, Trotsky was one of the chief architects of war communism. After the Bolsheviks' brief experiment with markets and a new economic policy. The core of the Soviet system was always the certainty that human beings must be reshaped to fit the needs of a new rational economy. The thought that the economy exists to serve the needs of human beings was dismissed. Again, I don't necessarily believe that. If you look at Sheila Fitzpatrick, I think that the way in which Stalin himself viewed the second 5-year plan was that the second 5-year plan was about material abundance. I think the phrase he used was "life has become more joyous, comrades." There were department stores in Moscow that for a while were kind of full of stuff. The idea was that through a kind of a brutal campaign of conquest of nature could be essentially be wrestled to the ground and forced to provide the proletarian man with all that it needed.
Instagram teen accounts, automatic protections for teens. Instagram teen accounts have built-in content settings and limits for who can contact teens. Plus, teens under 16 can't change these default safety settings without parental approval. So parents can help teens connect safely. Instagram teen accounts, automatic protections for who can contact teens and the content they can see. Learn more at instagram.com/teen accounts.
So, to continue, John Gray writes, the thinking that inspired market reform in Russia differs from Leninism in the economic systems it aimed to install, but its consequences in human suffering and economic devastation have been in some ways strikingly alike. Like the utopia envisaged by Lenin, the global free market aims to bring into being a state of affairs that never hitherto existed in human society, which goes far beyond the mid-Victorian English free market and the liberal international economic order that existed until 1914. In a global free market, the movement of goods, services, and capital are unfettered by political controls imposed by any sovereign state, and markets have been detached from their original societies and cultures. This is a utopia divorced from history, hostile to vital human needs, and finally as self-destroying as any that has been attempted in our century. That's the bit I think I do kind of agree with. And if you look at Quinn Slobodian in his book Globalists, you have almost sort of like a century of theorization about how you kind of recreate the version of the world that existed before 1914, which is essentially an imperial world, and how you marginalize domestic populations, how you say, these nuisance people that want kind of high wages and living standards and things like that, and get in the way of the sort of workings of this wonderful clockwork system we call the market. That's an example of creating a utopia divorced from the rules of history, trying to transplant economic models onto societies that find them really quite alien, and the ways of thinking about things really, really quite alien. I remember this kind of grotesque moment in the aftermath of the American invasion of Iraq, where there was an Iraqi an Iraqi citizen who was being confronted by this sort of very verbose, very boorish American soldier, and the American soldier was saying to him in kind of pidgin English, have you seen the guerrillas, the Fedayeen? Have they been here? And the guy was looking at him, whether he spoke English or not, I don't know, but was looking at him as if he's an idiot, like I'm going to tell you, well, you know what happens? They'll come around and shoot my family. But the guy was saying, if they come here, you've got to call us, and was doing a kind of telephone thing. And the man sort of shrugs and indicates, well, there's no phone masts here. There's no phones. I can't phone anybody, probably because you've bombed them. And then this is the weird bit, and it's stuck with me ever since. The American soldier, probably not the sharpest tooth on the saw, says, you have to get some capitalism. You have to get some capitalism. I don't know if he thought he'd invaded like a kind of Marxist utopia, but versions of capitalism, not the American version of capitalism, but versions of capitalism are present in places like Iraq. Just as there are people with accumulations of capital. There are people who, there are markets that function, and there is a state and that guarantees property rights and all these kinds of things. Often in the Iraqi case, quite violently. But the extent, it was an eye opener, because you firstly had a guy who was this American soldier who's almost this kind of evangelist for Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman and people like that, saying, you've got to get some capitalism here, as if it's like a thing you go and buy from a shop and install into your country. And by that's what will make the mobile phones appear. And that with the mobile phones, you can phone the US Army and they can come and kill the militiamen who might be hiding in your village. And it was such a bizarre, but such a revealing, such a fascinating, horrible moment. You have this kind of colonizer talking to a colonized person as if they are an idiot, but speaking almost in this kind of strange kind of ideological language, and far more you can't imagine a US soldier in 1945 saying something similar to a defeated, German, or perhaps they did, but I somewhat doubt it. It shows you the extent to which neoliberalism has become deeply ingrained within the society, not just American society, but Western thought, that you can come, bomb a country, kill enormous numbers of people, and then lecture the people in that country about this ever so clever thing that they can do. So global laissez-faire, writes John Gray, does not require totalitarian regimes. It does not extend the state so as to incorporate all other institutions, but reduces it to the most narrow repressive functions. Many of the functions of social control are devolved to markets, which would mould public opinion and shape consumer preferences. The global free market is a post-totalitarian utopia. It requires on the exercise of force chiefly at the peripheries of power and in the early stages of its construction. These things are constructed violently. Both the Soviet system and the free market are experiments in economic rationalism. The free marketeers tell us that the unprecedented productivity of a rational economic system will remove the causes of social conflict and war. Soviet Marxists used to assure us that the socialist planning would make scarcity a thing of the past. Both tell us that rising productivity will of itself solve most social problems. Both exalt economic growth over all other goals and values. Like the Bolsheviks, the shock troops of the free market are resolutely hostile to any tradition that stands in the way of what they view as economic progress. And if their goals demand the sacrifice of a few cultures on the way, it's a price which the free marketers do not shrink from paying. Global laissez-faire and the communist project that animated the former Soviet Union have many of the same enemies. They are hostile to national cultural differences in economic life and to the inheritances of tradition and history. They resent the backwardness of the peasants of village life. This is, we're on safe ground there now, John Gray. Safe ground, I agree. They're intolerant of the unruly individualism of the bourgeoisie and the refractoriness of the working people. The chief victims of the global free market, as of war communism and the Soviet system, are peasants, and to a lesser but still notable extent, urban industrial workers and the professional middle classes. To be used as a testing ground for Western utopias seems to be Russia's fate in the 20th century. Soviet communism was such a utopia, but so were Gorbachev's reforms and the policies of shock therapy which followed the Soviet collapse. The Soviet system, which Gorbachev sought to renew, was not reformable. It lacked political legitimacy in Russia and in the near abroad of the Soviet nationalities. Outside its enormous military sector, the Soviet economy worked only insofar as it sheltered black and grey markets. The Brezhnev era of stagnation was, for some people in the regions of the Soviet Union, an era of boom, since it institutionalized corruption and it enabled the market exchange to flourish.
Instagram teen accounts default teens into automatic protections for who can contact them and the content they can see. Explore teen accounts and all of our ongoing work to protect teens online at instagram.com/teen accounts.
It only happens every 4 years, and this time it's here. The biggest tournament in the world. Stadium shaking, flags waving. This is history, and you want to be there. But real life can make it tough. Work, busy schedules, and the price. That's where Priceline comes in. Priceline has millions of deals on flights, hotels, and rental cars so you can go see it live. So find a great deal and make the trip happen. Rally the crew, go see the game live, turn your dream trip into reality. Book now with Priceline.
Gorbachev's reform program, writes John Gray, began as an anti-corruption campaign. Its main aim was an acceleration of the economy. Among its first results was an economic slowdown, followed by collapse. The Soviet system of central planning could not function without the markets it condemned as criminal. The policies of shock therapy that were imposed in the wake of the Soviet regime were, in part, simply a reaction to that former economic system that had comprehensively collapsed. But they were also an attempt to rebuild Russia on the model of yet another Western utopia. They were policies that had achieved some of their objectives, and in other countries that they proved to be unworkable in Russia. By the time shock therapy was applied in late 1991, a gradual transition from central planning was impossible. The old Soviet economy had already largely disintegrated. Gorbachev's policies of structural reform of the economy and political liberalisation, perestroika and glasnost, respectively, had produced chaos. Not only the central planning institutions, but much of the apparatus of the Soviet state had fallen apart. The machinery for a programme of gradual reform was lacking. A phased dismantling of the old institutions and policies was not among the options of Russia's first post-communist government. Boris Yeltsin's principal inheritance from Mikhail Gorbachev was the impossibility of gradualism. The chief constituency for Gorbachev's reforms was always among opinion formers in Western countries. In the former Soviet Union, perestroika evoked ridicule and contempt. There was a really interesting interview recently with Tariq Ali on Novara Media, and you should definitely watch it. He's a fascinating and engaging guy, in which he pointed out that firstly, Gorbachev was a fool to trust the West, and that there were Russians at the time who could not believe that he was doing so, and that he, by placing his faith in Western reformism, he allowed the entirely, arguably unnecessary collapse of the Soviet Union. There is nothing inevitable about the Soviet Union's end. And Vladimir Putin has often said this as one of the great disasters of the 20th century. And so, I traveled across the Soviet Union in 1989, and every Russian I spoke to said basically the same thing: that Gorbachev was a fool and had essentially betrayed Russia. So manifestly unrealizable were Gorbachev's reforms that by the summer of 1989, it was clear to a Western observer that the Soviet Union had reached a pre-revolutionary condition. What we are witnessing in the Soviet Union is not the middle of a reform, but the beginnings of a revolution, whose course no one can foretell. Gorbachev's policies had revealed a system whose legitimacy was so slight that even those who most benefited from it, the communist nomenclatura, were unwilling to resort to repression to defend it. Uniquely, a vast empire with a terrible history of repression ceased to exist without significant violence on the other part of either the rulers or the ruled. When the coup was launched against Gorbachev on the 19th to the 21st of August 1991, it proved abortive, and it was evident that a new post-Soviet era was irreversible. The appointment in November 1991 of Yegor Gaidar to oversee Russia's transition to a market economy showed that Yeltsin understood that reform in a series of orderly sequences was no longer, if it had ever been, a possibility. Some kind of shock therapy, swift, radical and far-reaching measures, rather than piecemeal and incremental reforms, was unavoidable. Again, unavoidable is fine talk. There are a surprising amount of things that we look at with hindsight to find avoidable. It might be that Yeltsin could not see the economic suffering that this would cause. That's entirely possible. However, there is nothing about all of this I think that is inevitable. Yet the model on which the Russian shock therapy was based, the successful control of inflation in some Latin American countries, and the emulation of that success in post-communist Poland, had little application in Russia. The longevity of the communist regime in Russia and the enormous size of its military-industrial complex, accounting for around a third of GDP, were unique. More generally, the weakness in Russia of anything resembling the civil institutions that had made Poland the first post-communist country, together with the absence of traditions of legitimate private business, meant that the preconditions of successful shock therapy were lacking. Shock therapy presupposes a strong society and a robust, if repressed, economy. It cannot create them, and where it was applied in their absence, the results are predictably perverse. With the effective abandonment of shock therapy in 93 to 94, it was clear that Yeltsin had perceived that Russia's circumstances, together with its longer history, made the transplantation of any Western economic model impossible. The costs and the failure of shock therapy cannot be denied, even though that did not mean that there was a workable alternative policy of economic reform in late 1991. It was reasonable to argue that the piecemeal change was impossible and that catastrophic conditions in 91 to 92 in the catastrophic conditions of 91 to 92, but it was unreasonable to expect policies that had been applied with some measure of success in Bolivia or Poland to have similar results in the circumstances that prevailed in Russia. Many of the human costs incurred by these policies could not have been avoided, but they were imposed on Yeltsin's government as an historical fate. Their legacies of the Soviet system and Gorbachev's failed program of reform. But part of the tragedy of the shock therapy arose from the fact that it was an attempt to import into Russia an economic system modelled on the theories of Adam Smith. In an almost inevitable irony, the Smithian theory of economic modernisation had much in common with the Marxian theories on which the Soviet institutions had been based. As Jonathan Steele has commented, Karl Marx's theory of historical inevitability had been taken up by a new breed of social engineers, ensconced in the IMF, the US State Department, the Western European governments, and the editorial offices of most major Western newspapers. So, in short, the disasters that befall Russia are the removal of price controls, the mass privatization of industries, which basically both lead to spiraling inflation that wipe out life savings and lead to mass impoverishment. There's this bit in Secondhand Time by Svetlana Alexievich, which is a brilliant book, about how there was a civil engineer, somebody with a good professional job, reduced to having to buy toys from a toy factory. I think it was almost like, um, the kinds of things that you sell at a fair, loading them in a car and driving to Eastern Bloc countries to sell them for enough money to survive. This kind of absurd, disastrous situation where, by kind of imposing economic shock therapy, that had impoverished significant sections of Western countries. You apply this stuff to Britain and America, and mass unemployment follows. You have parts of Britain and America 50 years later that have not recovered from Thatcher and Reagan's policies. Applied to Russia, well, you get something perhaps even more catastrophic. And what you see is collapsing life expectancy. And this is the real crime, I think, or the greatest of neoliberalism's crimes: collapsing life expectancy, just as you see it in the USA. The only thing that probably has prevented that from happening in the UK is the NHS. And so you'll have an explosion of inequality, of wealth sucked upwards, as neoliberalism is kind of designed to do, and also this development of a new underclass where criminality becomes deeply embedded in everyday life. Not to say there wasn't criminality under the Soviet system. Of course there was. Even under Stalin, the Soviet camps were places where kind of Soviet gangsters ruled the roost, the Urki prisoners. So I think, to come back to my kind of previous point, I think it's something. I mean, John Gray has done an okay job here. Not brilliant, I don't think, but he's done an okay job. But I think one of the kind of the key disasters of our time was to treat Russia in this way, and for there to have been no settlement, no meaningful settlement at the end of the Cold War, no Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles itself, obviously, there were issues there. But I think also the idea that Russia could somehow be transformed into almost this kind of post-historical society, where Russian-ness or Soviet-ness no longer applied or had any meaning. Instead, the kind of the global language of markets and consumerism in this kind of end of history moment are all actually kind of matters or will ever matter again. The Cold War triumph. Sometimes you do have to take a step back and remember that there were people in very specific historical moments that had very specific ideas about how the world was going to be, and you could be forgiven for thinking that they were probably right. But that triumphalism is an extraordinary, powerful force. Deluded, sure, but powerful, yeah. And we exist with it now, I think, in different guises. But history just will not do what it is you think it will do or should do. It always surprises. Anyway, I've rambled on for long enough. I'll post some links down below on the Soviet Russian historiography bit. And overall, we're really kind of renovating the website now, particularly with students and teachers in mind. So when it gets to September, if you like this podcast, have a look. There'll be something useful there for you. Yeah, so I'll leave you there. Take care, everyone. All the best. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.